Did you know that you can take a 5-day paddleboat cruise traveling to the boyhood home of author Mark Twain and step into the town that inspired the Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about the life of a Riverlorian on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the life of a Riverlorian with historian and storyteller Brian Fox Ellis. But first, a trivia question. What's the longest-running holiday parade in the United States? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Brian Fox Ellis on my podcast today. Fox is a storyteller, freelance historian, author, historical reenactor, playwright, and innkeeper from Bishop Hill, Illinois. He currently hosts 2 PBS television series, History in Person and Fox Tales Folklore. He has a podcast called Fox Tales International, and he published 16 books last year by turning his scripts into manuscripts. Most important for us today is his unusual job title. For more than 25 years, he has been one of the world's few Riverlorians, a person who specializes in the lore of the river, which for Fox is working on the Spirit of Peoria riverboat. I attended Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and I lived in Peoria for 8 years when I was in my 20s. I'm very familiar with the Spirit of Peoria riverboat. When Fox mentioned that he'd worked as a Riverlorian on the Spirit of Peoria, my curiosity was immediately piqued. I hope this interview with Fox will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Fox. It's great to have you here. What inspired you to become a Riverlorian?
Well, honestly, when I took the job, I didn't even know what that word meant. When I moved to Peoria almost 30 years ago, my father-in-law was friends with a gentleman who had just purchased the Spirit of Peoria. And he knew that I had told stories on riverboats on the Ohio River. I used to live in Cincinnati, and he had seen me perform on the Belle of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky. And he said, you ought to go down and talk to the owner of the boat, Bud Greaves. So I walked in and introduced myself, and I said, you know, every riverboat needs to have a storyteller. And I'm also trained as a naturalist and can talk about birds. And I know you spend the night at Starved Rock State Park, so I could lead hikes in the park when we get there. And, you know, I know a lot of river history. And he's like, you're a what? I'm a storyteller, and every boat needs a storyteller. And by the end of a short conversation, he hired me, and I went on the first cruise that he hosted with just a few friends of his. And doing research, that's why I found the word Riverlorian. And I fell in love with it because my job is the lore of the river, you know, taking history and storytelling and really celebrating the place where we are. I love that idea of place-based storytelling. And so, you know, when I'm in a theater at a college convocations or someplace, I'll say, now imagine you're on a riverboat on the Illinois or Mississippi River. And here, we don't have to imagine. I mean, that rock over there, that's where this story took place.
That's fantastic. I love that. What is the typical day like for a Riverlorian?
We typically do overnight trips or 3 or 5 day trips. And so a typical day, my wife calls me gopher on the love boat. So it's my job to make sure that everybody else does their job. And because we have a couple of really great captains who are driving the boat, and we have a really good kitchen crew and deckhands, I don't have to worry too much about everybody else doing their job. But my primary responsibility is to make sure that passengers have a good time. And that's how I talk to them about my job. My job is to make sure you have a good time. Are you having a good time? I love my job. But as far as the lore of the river, so I wear a mic. So no matter where I am on the boat, usually it's metal decks. So some places it's a little problematic. I can just turn on my mic and start talking about whatever we pass. So I do a lot of informal. Off on the left is the town of Henry, Illinois. And then I tell a little story about Henry, Illinois. And actually I have different stories when we're going upstream and downstream, so that make sure I never repeat myself. But then twice a day, I do a more formal performance, usually about an hour before lunch and right after wine and cheese in the afternoon. And I do like to tease the audience. The stories are always funnier if you have an extra glass of wine, and it's free. So, or included in their ticket price. So the afternoon show is usually a little more fun. The morning is more introducing them to the boat and to the river. And then once we hit the shore, we spend the night at several different lodges along the river. It's not a big enough boat to have sleeping for all the passengers. Then I get people checked into their hotel room. If we have evening entertainment besides myself, I'll introduce them. But I also lead a hike. And that's another one of my favorite things is when you hike the same trail in every season and every weather for close to 30 years, the trail itself becomes a set of stories. And actually, this is one of my favorite ideas. If you study the Aborigine in the outback, or really any indigenous people who've lived in a place for 1,000 years, they have these stories of the place. And the way you find your way is with this story. So there's a point in the story that reminds you that there's a billabong coming up on the left, and that's where you turn. And there's a point in the story that talks about that rock that's, 2 miles away, but visible in the distance. And that leads you to the next point on the trail. I feel that way about the river because I've been working on this river for close to 30 years. And when I travel it in a canoe or a kayak at a different pace, there really is a story about every point in the trail. And that's the main focus of my job. But then the next day we get up in the morning and I lead a morning nature hike. Usually the evening hike is more a nature hike and the morning hike is more the history of the place, though those flip often. Then we get back on the boat and do it all over again, but with different stories for the next stretch of the river.
That's amazing. You mentioned that you have different types of stories for different seasons. Are you saying that the riverboat goes all year long?
Well, on the Illinois River, today it is -5 degrees. That's the high. Last night it was -17. So no, we shut down for just a couple months in January and February. And as soon as the river starts to thaw in March, we'll start up again. The overnight season, my main responsibility, really doesn't pick up until late May, early June, and runs till the end of October. And we do overnight trips on average once a week. Fall color, we sell out a lot of trips, so we add extra. And so we'll do 2 trips a week in late September, October, when fall color's at its peak. But then during Christmas, I've written a couple of Christmas shows. And in December, it really depends on the weather, whether or not we sail, but we still host a dinner theater with river-related Christmas stories. Actually, we have 3 shows now we rotate. So one is an Irish Christmas, because the musician I work with, he and I are both Irish, and everyone loves Irish Christmas stories. We also have a Prairie Christmas, which is more pioneer river related. And then more recently, we wrote a Civil War Christmas because the boats were at their peak just after the Civil War. And so it fits the time period.
You mentioned how much you love research. Would you tell us some of your favorite source material and what your research process is?
Well, knowing that your audience is curious, I thought they would love to hear a little bit about the research because it is my favorite part of my job. So when I first got this job 30 years ago, for about 10 years, every season before the season started, I would drive up and down the river or kayak or canoe the entire river and stop off in every little small town. I remember a dozen times walking into the library and doing some book scholarly research, but usually the librarian's a good person to know anyhow. And I would ask her who I should talk to. I'll never forget one time I went to Depew, Illinois, and yes, it does mean the stink. And they used to have one of the cleanest backwater sloughs where Anheuser-Busch bought ice because it was the cleanest ice in the Mississippi floodplain. Then they did have a toxic waste problem, and now they've cleaned it up again. But I stopped into Depew, and I saw school was letting out. I had actually just finished a performance at another school upstream. And so I hadn't been to Depew. I thought after school today, I'll stop in. And I saw these kids flooding out of the high school, and I walked up the steps, and I saw the principal standing there and introduced myself. And I said, I'm a Riverlorian. I'm a river researcher. I'd like to know more about the town. I'm curious, who would you recommend that I talk to? 3 hours later, I realized I found the guy. I kid you not. We first stood on the front steps of the school until after every last kid had left the building and half the staff was gone as well. And then he thought, oh, I should invite him in. And we went and sat in his office for another couple of hours. And it was literally a 3-hour interview. And I only had to ask one question. Who do I talk to in town? And Depew in particular is a fascinating town. They were founded back in the earliest days of the railroad because the river does a big bend there. And so railroad tracks going east, west, and north, south cross there. And so Bureau Junction is the railroad junction. And then during the Mexican Revolution in the turn of the last century, a lot of folks fled Mexico and they came to Bureau Junction to work on the railroads back in the late early 1900s. And then after the Vietnam War, there were a lot of Vietnamese boat people and Cambodians who came to the area. Oh, and before that, some of the early founders of the railroad, men who dug the canal, were Irish. And then there were a lot of Czech. There were so many Czech immigrants that in World War I, they outfitted an entire Czech military unit and sent them back to Czechoslovakia to fight against the Germans, self-equipped. And so I heard these dozens and dozens of stories of all the layers of immigration and all the rich history of that tiny little town from this one individual. And those are stories you mostly will not find in a history book. That's part of my job, is collecting and then preserving. I did just publish a book called The River of Stories that encapsulates a lot of those kinds of tales.
In your book, you state that the riverboat is a time machine. Can you tell us more about that?
That's my favorite thing to talk about. And if we had 3 weeks, I could get most of that in. But in just a couple sentences. So when passengers come on the boat, the first story I tell them, and I always begin every trip with this story because it gives all the other stories context, is I say straight up, the riverboat is a time machine. I used to say it's like a time machine, but it ain't like anything else. The moment you step on board the boat, you step back 100 years in time when riverboats were kings and queens of the inland waterways. But before there were steamboats, there were flatboats and keelboats and birch bark canoes and Native American dugout canoes. And I talk about the styles of boats being ways of traveling through time. But then also give them the big picture of the geological history that the Illinois River used to be the bed of the Mississippi River. And then the glaciers pushed it further west. And when the glaciers melted, they reopened that riverbed. So the Illinois River in stretches is more than a mile, almost 2 miles wide. And because of the silt deposited by the glaciers, the original river bottom is actually 100 feet below the river bottom today. And we've done geological expeditions or digs, sending probes down into that. And it's just fascinating to think about all those layers of geological history. And of course, the layers of Native American history. One of the things that a lot of people don't quite understand, it's a little hard to wrap your head around, is we often talk about mound builders, the mound building Indians of this area. Well, that's 3 very different cultures, 3 very different time periods, 3 different invasions and immigrations of American Indians. And we now have better genetics to understand that we have the archaic Indians, prehistoric. We have the early woodland mound builders, the Hopewell-Adena mound builders, and then the Mississippian mound builders. And that's before the historic tribes, the Illiniwek, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, and the other tribes that we still know of today. You know, there are relationships between these cultures. One learned from another, but often it was invasion as well as immigration and those various layers. So again, I love to talk about all of those layers like a wedding cake. You know, as you dig down deeper as an archaeologist, you begin to find more. As a storyteller in Riverlorian, I feel like that's my job, is to dive deep. And every year I dig a different ditch and find a different subject to explore and research.
Yeah, it sounds like it's always changing and always interesting and fascinating. And you can always find out more that you can share with the people that are taking your cruises.
Yeah, and we also do get a lot of people who come back year after year. We actually had a couple of couples who came 2 or 3 times a year, and they looked forward to the fact that I would tell different stories in the spring and the summer and the fall. And then, you know, I might repeat a few stories year to year, but over time, I'm always learning more and adding that to my performances.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you're integrating indigenous stories with immigrant stories and encapsulating that into American history.
Well, I am part Cherokee, and I really want to honor our ancestors and the folks who lived here before us. Actually, one of my newest books is about Black Hawk. And I originally wrote it as like a musical theater production and hired a local Native American drum and another American Indian storyteller friend of mine, Joe Lakota. And after the first performance, a young woman came up who is the descendant of Black Hawk, Makatai Mishi Kyak Kyak. And I guess she went home and told the elders, because I got a phone call a few weeks later, and I got invited not to perform for the public, but to perform for the Council of Elders from Oklahoma, who were coming back to Illinois to learn more about their ancestry and their lives here. And it was a little daunting for them to invite me to share their story. But I do think those layers are important, wherever you live, to begin to learn the layers of history and who lived here before us.
What do you love most about the Spirit of Peoria? What makes it so special?
Well, I am biased, but I do think it's the prettiest boat in the business. It's really a gorgeous little boat. And we, for a long time, were the only authentic paddle wheel boat doing overnight trips. A lot of the other bigger boats are built like the American Queen and the Duchess. They're basically big barges. And I really like what they do. And I actually have worked for them some. But their paddle wheel is fake and it's more for show. Our paddle is our only source of power. And it is a beautiful boat. I also like that we are a smaller boat. I mean, some of these big cruise ships are like cities, and they do have 30 or 50 staff and hundreds of passengers. Well, 100 is kind of our max. Legally, we can carry 350 passengers, but for an overnight trip, we set a limit of about 120 maybe. And so you feel like after a couple days, it's family. Also, a lot of the other boats travel at night, and then they dock at a town in the morning, maybe at 2 or 3 in the morning, and you wake up in a new town, and then you have shore excursions. And I actually work on some of those shore excursions for other boats leading tours of the town. So I think that's a cool idea. But our boat only travels during the day because we don't have sleeping quarters. We stay at historic lodges and often built by the CCC, those kinds of places. So you get to see the river when you travel on the Spirit of Peoria.
Yeah, that's amazing. I noticed that there was a 5-day riverboat cruise to the childhood home of Mark Twain, and I've added that to my bucket list.
Oh, please join us. That's one of my favorite trips.
Yeah, it looks so cool.
I have 3 or 4 hours of Mark Twain stories in my head, I could tell you.
I'm looking forward to that. What is your favorite story about the Illinois River?
Well, I'm sitting here in my office looking at my library, and there's a wonderful book called The Illinois by James Gray, and it really should be called I Am Infatuated with Abraham Lincoln. Because even though James Gray wrote this book 100 years ago, and he goes through all the layers of history and was kind of an inspiration for me of taking that as my approach, somehow in every chapter, he works in an Abraham Lincoln story. And so in a nutshell, since, I know we don't have a lot of time, one of my favorite little quips of a story, and we are also coming up on Lincoln's birthday. So one of my favorite Lincoln stories involving the riverboat. Most people don't know that Abraham Lincoln was a congressman in Washington. He was a federal congressman for one term before he won the White House years later. And during that term, we had gotten involved in an illegal war with Mexico, where our president lied to us to get us into that war. Doesn't that sound familiar? And Lincoln is this freshman congressman giving his first speech on the floor of the House. And it was actually both the House and the Senate were assembled. He calls out the president for lying and says this is an illegal war. And in the midst of this little speech, a congressman from Virginia, and that is key, stands up and begins to shout him down, begins to heckle him. And in those days, maybe your listeners know, it occasionally came to fisticuffs on the floor of Congress. And someone was caned to the point of unconsciousness in that time period. And Lincoln, some say, lost his train of thought. Some say that he was flustered by this heckler. I would like to believe otherwise. If you read the congressional transcript, this is one of Lincoln's stories, virtually verbatim. He said, and not exact quote, but he said, the congressman here reminds me of a riverboat that once sailed the Illinois River. Now, the captain of this boat wanted to build the grandest boat the river had ever seen, and he did. It was a floating palace. They call them wedding cakes, the way one deck stacks upon the next, complete with gingerbread trim. But he thought the grandest boat on the Illinois River should have the grandest calliope organ. And herein lies the problem. Being a steam engine with a steam organ, whenever they played a tune, the engine would stop running. And so seems to be the problem with this congressman. Whenever he opens his mouth, his brain stops working.
That's great. I love it.
So that's one of many my favorite Lincoln related. I actually have about 4 hours of Lincoln stories as well. Don't get me started.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. That's a good one. What is the most unusual thing that has happened to you on one of your riverboat cruises?
Oh, every day's an adventure. Because I am the Riverlorian, without going into a lot of detail, I remember one day I had to solve 4 life-threatening problems before breakfast. And there was another day where it was such a nice day. Everyone wanted to be outside. They didn't want to come in and hear the storyteller. I am mic'd throughout the boat, so you can hear me wherever you are. But it was such a nice day. People were saying, you should do your program on the third deck, which is an open deck. So I went up the third deck and I started my program. This gentleman was leaning on the smokestack, and it was an unusually warm day. In the middle of my program, splat, he falls face first on the deck, metal deck of the boat. And I thought, oh my God, talk about knocking him dead. This elderly gentleman just died in one of my programs. And then he wakes himself up, and he did have a bloody nose. It was pretty bad, but he laughed. So I can laugh now, I guess. At the time, we were all in a panic. He had just fallen asleep. And I used to get offended when people fell asleep in my programs. But if you think about it, you only fall asleep when you feel safe and relaxed and comfortable. And storytelling at bedtime is still a thing, I believe. And he said that he loved the show. It was just a very hot day and he was relaxed. Well, I could tell 100 stories like that, but I do love, like, one time in the middle of the program, and I do tell stories about big fish. This gentleman, the captain had turned up the engine. So this huge paddle wheel, we have 2x12 boards are the paddle, and they're setting, 2 to a paddle. So it's really a 24-inch paddle, the full width of the boat. And when the captain cranked up the paddle wheel, it actually scooped up about a 5-pound largemouth bass and tossed it onto the back of the second deck. And in the middle of my show, this gentleman picks up this bass. He runs around to the front of the boat. So he's now standing behind me, and there's a glass door there. And he's holding up this huge bass in the middle of my show. And everyone starts laughing. I'm thinking, this is not a funny part of the story. Why is everybody laughing? And then I turned around and I saw the bass. So neither of those had anything to do with me or my show, but it was fun. It was more about the fisherman and the gentleman. So
that's a great story. I love it. What is there a question that you wish people would ask you about being a Riverlorian?
Well, the one thing that I've been a little concerned about is there aren't any coming up behind me. When I first became a Riverlorian, there were 3 or 4 ahead of me. I'm forgetting her last name. She used to work on the Delta Queen, which for a long time was not allowed to sail because it's a wooden boat. And when they passed Coast Guard regulations that passenger boats had to be made of metal, it has a metal hull, but it's a wooden superstructure. It was grounded as a hotel for a number of years. It's recently grandfathered the laws, got a special act of Congress, so hopefully the Delta Queen will be sailing again. Well, I've had the great good fortune to tell stories on the Delta Queen before it was mothballed for a while. And so I met Toots and got to hear her tell stories. But when I began, there were maybe 3 or 4 Riverlorians in the business. Now I think I might be the last one. And I wish people would ask a very simple question. How do I become a Riverlorian? I would love to help train and pass on the knowledge to the next generation. And I do know that the American Queen is building new boats, that the Viking cruises are starting to come up the Mississippi, Illinois, and Ohio rivers. So there's not 100 jobs out there, but there are a growing number of jobs, not just on the Mississippi floodplain, but I also know that the Viking and American Cruise Line has ships on the Columbia River. And I also perform as Lewis and Clark and just published a book from Meriwether Lewis's River Time. So there is opportunity. So back to your original question, the simple question is, how do I become a Riverlorian? I wish people would ask, and I would gladly give them months of my time to help train them to learn what it takes to be a Riverlorian. And it is years of research. It's not something you just step into tomorrow.
Well, maybe one of our listeners will be interested in following in your footsteps.
It would be great. I still got 10 or 20 years left in me, I hope. But I need to train a replacement because eventually that day will come.
Well, if it takes that much time to get up to speed and do research, you might have to start training someone sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
You state that within each of us is a story to tell. What is your story?
That's a great question, because I'm often asking other people. I went to a workshop at the National Storytelling Association many, many years ago, and I met a a woman who at the time was seen as one of the great grandmothers of the modern revival of storytelling. Diane, can't believe I just forgot her last name. And she gave a lecture on this idea that everybody has a story that they tell. And she discerned hers, they were variations of Cinderella. And she published several books, including The Magic Orange Tree, which is Haitian folklore. Diane Wallstream, I want to say. Anyhow, I love her material, her research. She's a great scholar as well as a brilliant performer who has since passed away. And in this lecture, I kept thinking, well, what is my story? What is my story? And then I started looking at the books I had already published and the stories that I was really drawn to. And being a Riverlorian really fits because I'm really drawn to the story of the cycles of nature, that who we are is made up of molecules and minerals that have been here for billions of years. So my first children's picture book is called The Web at Dragonfly Pond. And it's a story about the food web and how what you had for dinner came from something that ate something that ate something that came from the earth. And we shall return to the earth. One of my most popular stories that I will be recording again tomorrow for a new project I'm working on, River Stories, is Walter the Water Molecule. Again, following a drop of water through the cycles of nature. That I'm really fascinated by that idea. I also portray Walt Whitman and have a new book out about Whitman this year. It's been a good year for writing. And Whitman, he said, and I love this quote, "Every time I breathe in, I breathe the outside world into myself." And literally every breath you take, you're exchanging molecules with that oak tree out in the lawn or that spruce tree up the side of the mountain. So that's, I guess my story is about the connection to the cycles of nature and the wild world.
I love that.
What's your story?
Oh, that's a terrible question because I wasn't expecting it.
What stories are you drawn to? What kind of stories?
Probably my favorite type of stories are fish out of water stories. I love those. Usually when I'm writing, I have fish out of water characters, and those are the books and movies that I'm most attracted to normally.
But that's a great tradition in river lore, is there's a lot of literally fish out of water stories.
Yeah, I know. Come to think of it, it kind of goes with this theme, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
That's funny. Is there anything else that you'd like for listeners to know about you or your work?
Well, I love storytelling, obviously, but the focus of my work has been a lot on bringing storytelling to new venues and to new audiences and new platforms. So like you, I am in love with podcasting, and I do have a podcast called Foxtails International. I've also been doing a lot of work for PBS of late, doing some documentaries, but recently I launched 2 television series. One is called History in Person, and it's the variety of characters that I portray, and I'm hiring friends who are also historical reenactors. And then the other is called Foxtails Folklore, and it's that connection of science and fairy tales. A lot of native cultures from around the world, if you look closely at their fables and folk tales, their creation stories, there's a lot of indigenous knowledge about the earth and our relationships to the earth. So that's the focus of Foxtails Folklore. So looking at different ways to tell stories, both of these television programs are available as podcast audio. They're available as books and ebooks, because I think in the modern world, I mean, this is a perfect example. Here we are doing a podcast. There's so many ways to get your news. And if you think about the storyteller as the town crier, I love experimenting with different platforms and being able to put the stories out there so that on any device, your smartphone or tablet, or if you still like paper as I do, you can read the books. That's the thing I've been most challenged by this year, because I usually do 400 live performances a year. And that hasn't been happening lately, but it's beginning to come back. And so I've had time to explore these other platforms, and that's been my learning curve.
How do you find time to do 400 live performances a year?
Well, I work. It's my job. I am crazy in that I often do 3 or 5 performances a day. You know, on a typical day on the riverboat, I do 2 formal performances. I consider the hike a performance because the trail is full of stories. So on a normal riverboat day, I'm doing 3 shows. But sometimes I'll go to a school and I'll do 5 or 7 performances, you know, every period. If it's a middle school, every time that bell rings, I've got a new audience of several hundred kids and I'm doing a different show. And then after school, I will drive to some local library or park, or maybe I'll do an after school workshop for teachers, then drive to the park district or library and do an evening family performance. My record is 10 shows in a day, and it's not uncommon for me to do 25 or more shows in a week, in a really busy week.
That's incredible. Where can listeners find out more about you?
Well, my website is Foxtails International, abbreviated INT, so foxtailsint.com. But I admit I'm in the midst of trying to redo my website, so I haven't updated it in a while. So if they go to YouTube or wherever they get their podcasts, Foxtails International, spell it out. You need the full word international. You can watch some storytelling on YouTube. You can listen on whatever device you catch your podcast. But of course, Amazon's a great place to get some books. Because I spent the past year turning a lot of my scripts into manuscripts, I don't even believe myself when I say this. I published 16 books last year. So it was almost a book a week for a while when the pandemic first struck. And I didn't know what else to do with myself. And I did, hire copy editors and designers. And I've kind of launched my own publishing company. So it's a little more than just self-published because I'm including books and stories from other people as well. Foxtails International is the name of the publishing company. And there's biographies of some of the characters I portray, as well as collections of folklore. And the one we've been talking about today, the first book in the series, is called A River of Stories. And it's what I love about the book is a little tricky weaving and braiding this together. It is both a geographical tour of the river that begins up near Chicago and goes down to the Mississippi River, but it's also a timeline. River's a time machine. And so it's a tour of the river, both geographically and a tour through time. So there's American Indian and Pioneer, of course, a couple Lincoln stories, Underground Railroad, and some more modern ghost stories, because I want you to think, is every story true? As Mark Twain said, not every story is true, but there's truth in every story, and never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
That's fantastic. That's a wonderful place to end our interview today. I want to thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure meeting you.
Well, thanks for having me, Dr. B, and I look forward to hearing more of your podcast. This is pretty exciting.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. What is the longest running holiday parade in the United States? It's Peoria's annual Santa Claus Parade, the longest running parade in the country. It was established in 1887 and has been held continuously ever since. We'll end the show with something punny. Where do fish keep their money? In riverbanks. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.